Yes, indeed. It is called Lothric, where the transitory lands of the Lords of Cinder converge. In venturing north, the pilgrims discover the truth of the old words. The fire fades, and the lords go without thrones. When the link of fire is threatened, the bell tolls, unearthing the old lords of Cinder from their graves. Aldrich, saint of the deep, Farron's undead legion, the Abyss Watchers. And the reclusive lord of the profaned capital, Yon the Giant.
What makes Dark Souls 3 a great game? Oh, wait, maybe we should try an even broader question. What makes a video game great? When making a video game, there are so many aspects that need to be implemented to make it great. This can be gameplay, graphics, sound effects, music, and story. However, that last topic is usually what can make or break a game. If a game has great gameplay and doesn't rely on the story for players to be engaged with it, they usually fall under games like Superliminal, Yume Nikki, and most recently, Teardown. Now, if the roles are reversed, where the story matters more, then we have games like What Remains of Edith Finch, Machinarium, and Soma. And while all these games I just mentioned are indie titles, AAA studios do this as well. If you want to have a meaningful story told to you, while gameplay takes more of a back seat, The Last of Us is a great pick. But if you don't care and you just want to shoot things, then Doom Eternal is just for you. But what about a game that could balance both gameplay and story almost perfectly? A game that both intrigues you with its narrative, but keeps the player coming back to finish what they started. When was the last time you played a game like this? Now, while everyone has different opinions, I'm going to list up a couple of my personal favorites. BioShock by Irrational Games, with its engaging setting and story, showed that video games could be more than just gunning and running through a world that didn't punish the player. Inscription, a game by Daniel Mullins, is a card game that comes with a mystery, showing how far the player is willing to go to discover the truth. But today's game is seemingly not one of those on the surface. Dark Souls as a series is mainly centered around its simple yet effective gameplay loop. You hit something, or it hits you. You either kill the enemy, or it kills you. And if it kills you, it's all the way back to the last checkpoint you reached. And while there is a lot of lore to cover in this series that has spanned 3 games, I would argue that the story isn't the forefront of any of the Dark Souls games, besides the very basic plot and goal for your character to embark on. But while playing, the game is telling you a story, but it's not using words. It shows you the scenes that characterize the area or fit the main theme of the game. and you most likely ignored it as you went on to the next bonfire. So, join me today as I take a look at the non-conventional storytelling that is told for the journey that is Dark Souls 3. To save you some time, I will be splitting this video up into 5 sections. The sections are world space, item placement, lighting, bosses, and music. I will leave the timestamps in the description of the video for a section that you personally want to see. This video will go into spoilers for the whole game, so if you haven't played it, I would say at least give it a try and come back to me, or just watch gameplay of it. Now, while I usually like to explain what is going on in most of these parts, I just want you to take in these world spaces. No commentary, no music, just the sound, sight, and wonders of this dying world. This world seems intriguing, and for most players, there may be a lust to uncover the secrets hidden throughout Lothric. First stepping out into the world of Dark Souls 3, the tutorial area creates a sense that the player has a long journey in front of them. This is immersion, and it started back when 3D was slowly becoming normal for video games. To understand this, it is important to distinguish the difference between a presence and immersion. For presence, scholars have defined it as the feeling of being there, and immersion is having the player caught up in the world of the game's story. Unfortunately, both of these words are loosely defined and are interchangeable. So, to give an example for presence, one trend that has been popular during the last year and a half is liminal spaces. It's this phenomenon where photos are taken of these empty spaces and can sometimes have the effect on the viewer that makes them think that they've been there. So, perhaps to an adult, this picture of an old ballroom might remind them of a wedding they attended. Or if you're a part of the younger generation, this picture of a random abandoned mall creates the longing for days of youth, where you were blissfully ignorant and not burdened by the troubles of the present. For immersion, I would say it's you reading your favorite book. You are immersed in the story, the characters, the setting, and more smaller aspects as you turn each page. When talking specifically about immersion, I want to refer to Alison McMahon in the section Immersion, Engagement, and Presence from the book The Video Game Theory Reader, which I highly recommend if you want to go into early game theory from 2003. McMahon states that there are 3 conditions to create the sense of immersion. The user's expectations of the game or environment must match the environment's conventions fairly closely. The user's actions must have a non-trivial impact on the environment. And lastly, The conventions of the world must be consistent, even if they don't match those of meat space, or the physical world. If we take each of these points and apply them to this famous shot from the opening, we can dissect what makes it immersive. From the first point, the user's expectations from the intro is that this world is bleak. So, for the player to see this building in the distance, there is already a goal for the player to proceed and find out what's inside. For the second point, once again, the goal in mind for the main character, the Ashen One, is to extinguish the flames of the Lords of Cinder. So, the player gets the thought that this is going to be a long journey, similar to the hero's journey. Whether the player has a feeling to bend the world to their will, or to try and bring peace and happiness to the non-playable characters in the story, they are both the driving force to see what is out there. And third, the setting of this graveyard, even though in sad ruins, still grounds itself in the world space as familiar to the viewers. And while possibly cliché, the church-looking structure in the distance seems like a safe haven. So, with nowhere to go, the player heads off to the Firelink Shrine. At the beginning of the game, the player is introduced to how they can acquire loot. While there are treasure chests in generic adventure game fashion, most of the loot they will find is on charred bodies with a light coming from their torso. Once near it, they can acquire anything from items to weapons to shields and much more. And with hundreds of these bodies scattered across the world, there is always the sense of exploration to find the next great item. But many of them are in out-of-reach places. Take, for example, this body. To get this item, the player will have to go through these enemies to get to said item. Another example is a jump that the player has to make during the tutorial area. While awkward to pull off, the player is rewarded for learning the controls with an item that they can use. And this can be considered general game design, as tutorials are often used to ease the player into the world and the game. For Torben Grodel, the definition of play can be general. They state, "The computer story, in contrast, is only developed by the player's active participation, and the player needs to possess a series of specific skills to develop the story, from concrete motor skills and routines to a series of planning skills. Therefore, the new activations also increase the capacity problems, and the increased demand on working memory space also increases immersion." While I stated earlier that tutorials are a staple of games, showing the player these mechanics like jumping tells them that items will be in places that are not always out in the open and may lead to new areas. There is a note telling the player of a bridge that reads, "Suspended bridge is wearing thin," telling the player that the bridge can collapse if hit. When the player goes to pick up the items left at one end of the bridge, enemies start to form, leading the player to quickly cross the bridge. Since the amount of enemies will overwhelm the player, they will most likely think to hit the bridge and learn of this game mechanic. Later in the DLC, Ashes of Ariandel, there is another long bridge that leads to a chapel. If the player remembers what they performed back in the catacombs, destroying this bridge will lead to a new area of the DLC and an optional boss. In this regard, these items act as a breadcrumb trail to make the player learn about how to interact with the world. They create small stories the player can remember and use later in similar situations, effectively conditioning them. So, while picking up these items are pretty mindless on the surface, the conditioning they provide through gameplay makes them prime for non-verbal storytelling. To segue into this next segment, I need to talk about diegetic and non-diegetic lighting. Say you are watching Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. You are at the scene where Norman Bates looks through the peephole at Marion Crane. If we observe the lighting around Norman's eye, the light is controlled in a way to have you focus on the extra close-up shot. This is diegetic lighting. It's where the director is intentionally using the light of this world to have the audience focus on an aspect of the scene. On the other hand, non-diegetic lighting has no relation to the world of the film, but is still used to direct the audience at an object or character. An example could be from this famous shot of Nosferatu, directed by F.W. Murnau. As Count Orlok climbs the stairs to Ellen, the main character's wife, we can see his shadow engulfing the wall, showing how evil is consuming every inch of the building and the power that Orlok has. For game design, lighting can be used in a multitude of ways in video games, either as a core gameplay feature or for the environment most of the time. For Dark Souls 3, there are many areas where lighting is used to convey something important, whether it be a statue where the player can commend themselves to the Covenant of the Sun, or even the bonfire that the player sits at to restore health. For most of the game, players wouldn't think much on where they need to go and just follow a path guided by this light. In many ways, video games are just like interactive movies, no matter the genre. To go back to Torben Grodel and her article, the visual medium of film for the past 100 years has opened up ways for the viewer to connect with movies. She states, "The focusing and framing of persons, objects, and events emulate and cue the working of our attention. The representation can furthermore represent various aspects of reality with photographic verisimilitude." While the author is tapping more into the emotional side of film like the story, lighting is just as important in any medium someone observes today. For Dark Souls 3, the diegetic lighting can project themes and emotions for the player to encounter. Referring to the sunlight statue again, the lighting can infer a sense of protection or serenity that even if the statue is not in its former glory, it carries a symbol of hope. And while we know that this dark world has many stories of death and loss, lighting can show the player of stories told of good and prosperity like in this statue. In the late game, the player can find an area of Lothric Castle called the Consumed King's Garden. At first, the player trudges through some hard enemies, the poisonous landscape, finally makes it to a stairwell. Thinking that this is going to be another dungeon, a cutscene plays as the player goes through a doorway.
You ignorant slaves. Finally taken notice, have you? Of the power of my beloved Ocelot, child of dragons. Well, I will not give him up. For he is all that I have.
Now, the player must fight another boss. Oceiros uses a range of magical attacks and tail whips to kill the player. When the player whittles down the king's health enough, the second phase begins.
My dear little Ocelot.
To get on a personal level, I typically do not get scared at many attempts in horror in video games today. Usually I think that ambiance can play a bigger role of making the player uneasy. But, as you heard, when that baby started to cry during the fight, I felt like I did something horrible. If we start with the player, by this point in the story, the Ashen One has overcome many bosses, some of them being Lords of Cinder. And while obtaining gear and killing bosses has made the character stronger, the most important aspect is the death of the character many times throughout this playthrough. To go yet to another source, Bob Rahak writes in Playing at Bean, a psychoanalyst of avatars in video games, he states, "But most significant, avatars differ from us through the ability to live, die, and live again. Their bodies dissolve in radioactive slime or explode in mist of blood, and bone fragments only reappear unscathed at the click of a mouse." While a staple of the Dark Souls series is its brutal difficulty, the player coming back from death serves as a clean slate and forces them to learn from other mistakes. And for many of the bosses, they have been silent or they speak in ramblings, always turning to the player and charging at them to kill them. So for a boss like Oceiros to talk and have a reason to attack the player, it can feel unsettling. Looking at this screenshot for Oceiros makes him seem gangly and old. But besides those attributes, the player is trying to comprehend what this boss is supposed to be, possibly causing panic and terror. And, of course, the cries of the infant ringing out during the fight. For most people, the sound of an infant crying can usually trigger an emotional response. And while everybody is different, I would argue that many would feel we should help the baby or be still, not knowing how to react. This suspense can be used effectively in video games, as Grodel states. They explain, video games also evoke suspense related to the outcome of local sequences as well as related to the final outcome of the game. The outcome in a given game is, in principle, just as uncertain the second time through as it is the first time. Even for the brief time that Oceiros spoke, both the body language from the fight and the player's imagination can form a story to tell others about. And while playing, the player is listening to what others have to say in this world, forming their own opinions, theories, and thoughts about what could be happening. Of course, there is an explanation for what Oceiros is and what he is talking about if the player goes in to dig for answers. But if the answer was right in front of the player, there would be an emotional disconnect to the boss. It's like being told of jump scares in a horror movie before they happen. It loses its merit. So, while Oceiros is optional and possibly easy for most people, the first time playing through the game and multiple playthroughs later, this boss's unsettling aura and design can create a story that many people will remember, whether that be from how difficult it was or horrified at the sight of the consumed king. But while I have talked about moments and experiences that are from sight, what about moments for sound? If one were to look into the soundtrack for Dark Souls 3, there are only 24 tracks of music in the entire game and including the downloadable content, which at first may seem strange of a game of this scale to have. This can be a great business tactic, however, as stated by Justin Fisher at the Game Developers Conference in 2017. He states while sparse music scores cut the cost go into making a video game, it also is a stylistic choice on the developer's part to make the world seem more desolate to players, and also amping up the action when fighting a boss. And while this definitely fits because of the identity created by From Software, the music plays a key part in showing more of a theme for these bosses the player fights. But now I wish to turn away our focus from Dark Souls 3 for just a minute and into a different, darker place. Bloodborne is a PlayStation 4 exclusive that is a Lovecraftian-themed game about a hunter going out and slaughtering the prey that are terrorizing the fictional city of Yharnam. And while I am still playing it, I wish to focus on one boss theme compared to another one in Dark Souls 3.
Beasts all over the shop. You'll be one of them, sooner or later.
For the first boss, Father Gascoigne, directed by these people on screen, the score starts off very subdued with an occasional hint of rising strings. Slowly, the string section grows louder as the brass section joins in.
What's that smell? The sweet blood. Oh, it seems to me it's enough to make a man sick.
Then finally, the climax comes to a head as the choir joins in. The music grows faster as if it were on a runaway train, the player fighting life and death within Gascoigne. After changing into his beast form, the player defeats it, overcoming the first boss. While Bloodborne is very different in theme to Dark Souls 3, heavily being inspired by H.P. Lovecraft cosmic horror, it's supposed to condition the player for more bosses later. Alexander Kolassa touches on this in his essay by stating, "So far, the music in Bloodborne have been played on the boundaries of musical diegesis in its depiction of monster bosses and, as such, has lightly conditioned in the player an appropriate response. Hearing music in a more traditional trans-diegetic setting, suggestive of both traditional atmosphere-establishing scoring and the prospect of real presences, was made even more strange as a result. For much of Bloodborne, the player is spent questioning and trying to ground monsters and bosses they see in reality. So for them to see a boss like this later in the game, the score adds a feeling of the player going up against something from another world. Let's go back and take the theme from the boss Oceiros, the Consumed King, composed by Yuki Kitamura. While this is just the opening, listening and looking at the character design creates some dread similar to the bosses of Bloodborne. With a boss called the Consumed King, the player can possibly assume that what this person once was, they are not anymore. This first phase part of the score illustrates inhumanity and suffering for this boss, and it has the player question the morality of their actions. And in the second phase of the piece, the choir grows louder in tone as it's paired with more bombastic orchestral score as the brass, percussion, and string show Oceiros losing what little humanity had left, going berserk on the player. The music continues to immerse the player into slaying the boss. Their goal is either to put Oceiros out of his misery, or for them to end this psychological nightmare. In conclusion, for both scenarios, while split between two separate games, the thematic additions to musical instruments, combined with the player's attempt to ground their reality on the same level as both bosses, the storytelling is told through these fights, for the player to remember time and time again upon facing against countless other foes. As I was writing the end of this video essay, the first Dark Souls game was awarded the Ultimate Game of All Time at the Golden Joystick Awards this year. While I was first puzzled by its title, it hit me. For a series that has spawned hundreds of thousands of fans across the world, coined a genre that is now more frequented indie titles, and thousands of memes that it has spawned over the past decade, I can see why calling it the Ultimate Game makes a lot of sense when you look back at the series as a whole. And linking this back to Dark Souls 3, the way that it shows non-conventional storytelling through the world, item placement, lighting, bosses, and music really turned this game from a generic hack and slash to something much more substantial. And after going through and beating the game again for this video, it made me appreciate those details From Software put into this world and characters that much more. And while I have come to the end of the Journey of the Ashen One, I look forward to starting a new one with their next game, Elden Ring. If you got to the end of the video, thank you for watching. This took about a month and a half to make, and I have no one to thank but my English teacher. Without your continued support and helping me find the sources, I would have never had the courage to do this. So, one last time, thank you. And, of course, the viewer, thank you for watching. May the flame never die out.